Driving, 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 music's blaring.
That's just to whet your appetite. Why don't we talk about the weather? What's the weather like?
The weather, it is cold cold. It is currently 16 degrees in Portland. Tonight it will be clear, dipping to 9 degrees. Tomorrow, Saturday, it will be partly sunny with a high of 27 and a low of, again, 9 degrees. Sunday and Monday, the highs will be around 17, the low around 12, and there's snow possible both days.
Well, thanks very much, and let's go back to our theme music.
Let's try this again, right?
Let's once more with feeling. Here's our theme music.
Driving, 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 music's blaring in my ears. Engines roaring, 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 the horizon's drawing near. Pedal to the floor, no more feet in the door. Gonna drive right out of this bitter night. I'm a constant seeker in Converse sneakers.
Welcome to Nonprofit Insider. My name is David Unger, and I'm pleased to be hosting a show with executive directors and key people of local nonprofits. I personally have worked in the nonprofit world for over 30 years. In those years, I've realized that the majority of the community does not know about the organizations that provide critical services and benefits to our community that we sometimes take for granted. Nonprofit Insider is a chance to hear about the organizations that touch so many in our community. The opinions expressed on Nonprofit Insider are not necessarily those of WMPG, its staff and underwriters, or of USM. So, Deb, I am going to be taking a speed talking course so I can keep up with her. I don't want to be, just another person. Okay. All right. So today we have John Bradley. John is the Associate Director of Preble Street. Welcome, John.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. So it is cold out there, isn't it?
It is very cold, yes.
And you did a great job with the weather.
Well, thank you. It helps that it's cold and exciting.
Okay. So Preble Street, I know a lot of people have heard of it. You hear about it in the news on occasion. It's a major icon in the Portland community, but what is it?
Wow. What is Preble Street? Well, we are a nonprofit that primarily serves homeless people and low-income people, people in poverty, with a whole range of services. Our mission is to deal with hunger, homelessness, poverty, and to really try to make changes both for individuals and in the systems that affect those folks. So we have a very strong service component that includes everything from meeting basic needs such as shelter, food, clothing, to providing model housing programs that serve some of our most challenged and vulnerable people in the community.
So when you talk about homeless, in my experience, there's been several definitions of what a homeless person would be. So what is the standard definition?
I'm not sure there's really a standard definition anymore. We get, just for example, we get funded by a number of different sources that are targeting homeless people, whether it's homeless youth or homeless families or homeless adults. And interestingly enough, they often have different definitions of what homelessness is. The primary definition that's used by the biggest planner and funder around homelessness, which is HUD, Housing and Urban Development, is really defined as people who are literally in shelters, sleeping outside, or in places that are not meant for human habitation, which can include things like sleeping in a car every night. Doesn't include their definition some of the other populations that we certainly serve, who may be going from friend to friend, house to house. We call it couch surfing, right. Or folks that are finding other ways to manage, but still are really without a stable living situation.
And what would be your best guesstimate? I'm sure the numbers can't be really nailed down, but what would be your best guesstimate of how many people in the Portland community are affected by this?
We can certainly estimate that on many days there are certainly close to 500 people if you include all of the individuals who are homeless in the individual homeless shelters, as well as families and youth and those that are unstable in other ways, including sleeping out or maybe temporarily staying with somebody and maybe in and out of shelters. Our shelter population approaches many nights 300. Just in the individual shelters for individual adults. And that has gone down. We've worked very hard to get the numbers down, and we've lately seen them creeping up again closer to 300. We've had nights of close to 200. We had 287 one night this last week. And then when you add families, domestic violence shelters, youth shelters, and all the other possible places that people might be staying, I think we can say we get close to 500.
Well, is that, and I get, again, this is a guesstimate, is that above, below average to what other communities are experiencing?
Portland has a unique place in Maine, certainly, and in many ways we have policies that we think are really the right ones around homelessness that enable us to really shelter lots of folks that in other communities are really put out. So what I would say is, number one, Portland has a high rate of homelessness relative to many communities, but partly because we actually find them, do outreach, count them, offer those basic services, don't abandon them out in the world, and so we know who they are and we serve them. Being the kind of urban center of Maine, we really are the focal point for lots of services and lots of opportunities in southern Maine and really in Maine in general. So when you combine the fact that Portland has made real commitments to providing services and to helping people who are homeless, with the fact that we are a place that attracts people because it has a street culture, because it has work opportunities, and also because other places will basically tell them, go to Portland.
Right.
We tend to have more of a problem than most of other communities, certainly in Maine. There are other communities, certainly in the states, that have high rates of homelessness, and often they are the urban centers in states that may be more rural, or even in the big centers in communities where there's lots of smaller suburban communities. People tend to gravitate where services are and where access to street culture even is for some people.
Right. So in weather like this, when it's so bitter cold, and I know there's folks who go around and encourage people to come inside to the shelters and things of that sort, but we can't force those people to do that, can we?
No. We encourage, and we do outreach actively. Preble Street has outreach workers. There's actually a van that goes around all the time, but certainly focuses on places that people might be out. That is run by Milestone Foundation. We all coordinate to really get out there when we anticipate really cold weather. But we can't make people come in. What our commitment is in Portland, and what Preble Street's commitment is we don't want anybody sleeping outside who doesn't choose to, and choose to after our trying to coax them into a safer place. That's a kind of a unique commitment that Portland has let us, and Portland as a city has made. Almost no other community in the country has that kind of commitment to really trying to make sure people are safe.
So when an individual does go into a shelter, maybe, I don't know, what happens?
Okay.
How does that work?
Well, when we're talking about sleeping shelters for adults, and I think that's the largest population,
Let's
and
just
that's what
focus on that
everybody, it's different for families a little, it's different for youth. In Portland, at this point, we have three shelters really that exist. The largest and the one that most people would be aware of is Oxford Street Shelter, which is run by the city. It can potentially hold 154 people and is a low barrier shelter, meaning that they really encourage everybody to come in if they can be in there safely. We have another shelter, Milestone, which works particularly with people who are using substances, alcoholics in particular, and that's about 40 beds. And we have about 40 beds at Florence House, which is a women's shelter. On any given night now, all of those programs are full, And we end up with Oxford Street, which is the largest, and kind of the general shelter, adding an overflow space, which is uses Preble Street's day shelter space to house 75, has other people either going to the general assistance offices or sitting up at Oxford Street in chairs. What someone gets when they go to any of these shelters, certainly with the exception of a few beds at Florence House, is getting to sleep on a rubber mat or a mat on the floor, about 6 inches from the next person on either side, because we have to use every single inch we can. They get put down all over. People get to lie down and sleep there next to strangers. We try to get everybody settled, I think, in all the shelters fairly early, but, people can come in at any time, so there's disruption. It's not a fun thing to be doing.
Right.
Of course, for the same person, when they wake up in the morning at 6 o'clock or so, then they have to find a way to get up, get out, and then go over to the day shelter or to the breakfast program.
So
if
the
they're gonna
shelters
eat.
have to empty out each night.
Exactly. They empty
Okay.
out each night, and the people who are homeless have to move between sleeping, going at 6 o'clock, waiting in line to get a mat, to going back to, say, Preble Street if they're needing services there or going to eat their meals there, and they're the only meals really available. Or for those kind of lucky people maybe who might be working, they get up from the mat, try to get a shower or whatever, and carry everything they have on their backs to their job. So it's a challenging life, and the shelters are really not fun. I think people have some misunderstandings of how luxurious they are for people, why
Right.
they would attract people to coming.
So shower facilities, are they there, or is it just strictly toilets?
There are toilets. There are some shower facilities. We in the day shelter have showers that, and I think most of the people will use the showers there. You can basically sign up because there's a line to take showers. We have laundry that people can do, again, signing up, so you really got to get there early and get in line. But again, we try to meet those kind of basic needs that include, food, shower, clothing,
Great.
even using a telephone or being a mailing address. I mean, things that people who are homeless really need even to move forward.
What percentage, and I know this is going to be a guesstimate unless for your grant purposes you have this down pat, what percentage actually move on and find a permanent living situation?
Almost everybody. I think one of the things that is often misunderstood about the homeless population is that most of the people who use shelters in those great numbers, say 300 people in a night, are going to move on within weeks, days or weeks. And they're going to move on because they have come there because they have no alternative. They may have lost their jobs. They may have had a family breakup of some sort. There may have been some kind of emergency. Often it's somebody who came for a job and thought they had a place to live and everything was set up and then fell apart. And, they don't have the resources. But those people have the potential with very little help and sometimes no help to move on by finding work, by returning somewhere else if there's, this was a bad choice. And there really is a quick flow. There's another group that's much smaller that's going to take months because they really do need a fair amount of support. Maybe they do need help with some public assistance, some entitlements. They have some complex issues that have gotten in the way of their work.
I'm going to have to cut here for a second because we are at our midpoint identifier, and it's time for our trivia question.
Oh.
And we take pride in our trivia question because it's usually useless information that will have absolutely no bearing on anything that you do for the rest of your life.
Good. That's my kind of question.
All right. So today's trivia question. Are we ready? Drum roll, Deb. There we go. Maine has how many haunted inns and lighthouses? You're not
That's trivial.
You're not supposed to laugh yet. So let me go to the midpoint identifier, and you can't Google it, Deb. The midpoint identifier. This is Nonprofit Insider on listener-supported WNPG 90.9 and 104.1 FM community radio of Southern Maine and Eastern New Hampshire. Joining us today is John Bradley, Associate Director of Preble Street.
So I have to answer that. It's not a multiple choice. Huh?
Nope, you
I
get
have to
one
just-
shot at this.
Okay. How many? I will say 80.
Nope. According to visitmaine.net, there are 18 listed haunted inns and lighthouses.
They've missed a lot of them.
I know.
I believe.
So,
Oh, I was going to say, I was telling you about the homeless population. I want to finish a real quick point because I think it's
yeah,
important.
the midpoint identifier always kind of breaks things up.
The smallest group of people are the people who are chronically homeless, and it's a group that can range from 100 over time. I don't mean each night, to a couple of hundred.
Is this part of the 500?
This is a part of that, but that's
Okay.
the group over years. And in any given night, it's really like 10, 15% of the population that we're really struggling with. But those folks are the folks with major mental illness, often substance abuse. They're the folks that people often see on the streets and identify as homeless. And they're really a small percentage, but they take the most work and are the most vulnerable. So in a sense, that's who we often target. They also take up a lot of beds because they're there every night. So
Right.
we really spend a lot of time trying to move them out, knowing that if we can get 30 people out tonight, that's 30 less people there every night. So that's a big target, is that chronically homeless. But they are really a smaller percentage. Many of the folks that come, the majority by far, move out fairly quickly.
See, I would have thought it backwards.
Yeah, most people do. But the data is pretty clear. We keep track. The city
yeah.
does of the flow, and again, but what the public sees, and what we also spend enormous amounts of time working with are those folks that are on the streets, those folks that can be disruptive at times to the
Right.
community, that have a lot of contacts with police or law enforcement, that are in people's in front of a store. But those really are a relatively small group that get a lot of focus. And we've had some major success in getting a lot of those individuals off the street. But the others go on their own with much less support.
So, during our pre-show warm-up, that was very short because I was late today, we were talking about the homeless...
The advocacy?
The advocacy. Not the advocacy, but
The Homeless Voices for Justice,
Yes,
I think you were
yes.
asking about.
I've heard about this program several times, but I really don't know anything about it.
Okay. Well, Homeless Voices for Justice is this incredible group. And it's a program in a sense, but it really works somewhat independently of Preble Street. It's kind of a really interesting balance. We've helped fund them, and we provide a community organizer. The group there's a leadership group for the Homeless Voices for Justice that's made up of individuals, all of whom have been homeless and are now housed and have decided to really dedicate time to really addressing homeless issues on a whole host of levels, because they advocate for individuals at times, but they really work on all levels, from municipal to state, even to federal legislation and activities. There's usually a core group of maybe 6 or 8 members, but they also do community meetings with the entire population at Preble Street, or whoever's willing. And we consider all of our consumers, all the people who use our services, members of our Voices for Justice. And when we're, for instance, involved, or they're involved in organizing an event, they will pull from our entire community to go up to Augusta to a legislative hearing, or to be part of the longest night of the year, solstice, where we really talk about people who've died in the year. So there's a large group. Over the years, that group has done many different activities, and one of the things that we're very proud of now is that they have expanded to working with shelters all over the state. So there are now chapters in York County, in Augusta, in Lewiston, and along the coast. So they're independent in their decision making. They have their own regular meetings. Much of the time we're in concert, in the sense that Preble Street and the
Right.
Voices for Justice have the same opinion, but not always. We've had times when they took much stronger stands, or different stands, than Preble Street and this organization does, and we've made it clear that they make their own decisions. Our goal is to really help them organize, but not tell them what to think.
How many people are involved with that?
Over the years, there have been dozens. I think at any given time, like I say, there's a core group that may be 6 or 8 people who do a lot of public speaking, who write letters to the editor, who testify regularly. But they also draw in members from across the state, where I think at this point there's probably a few dozen, and also from the people who are using homeless shelters, or especially our day shelter, and that can be many, many more who get involved in letter writing or in registration. One of their big campaigns is voter registration, and they've, over the whatever 10, 15 years that they've had You Don't Need a Home to Vote, they've probably registered, thousands.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
So, outside of funding, because everybody says funding, what do you see one of the bigger issues that's going to be facing Preble Street in the next year or so?
Wow. It's hard to separate funding in the sense that I think what faces Preble Street in a big way is public understanding and misunderstanding in a lot of the communications that are happening across the country and certainly in the state about issues of poverty and about homelessness. So the messaging, ultimately affects what the public understands or how they understand things, and often a lot of what's said about misuse of funds, about dependent people, about the fact that people who are homeless because they want to be, or they're here because we have such wonderful things going on. I think, in a big way, that messaging to me is probably the most concerning. It's something we keep trying to think of. How can we actually educate people on what poverty really looks like, how people really struggle, and not have them thinking they're just wasting tax money, when there are people with a little bit of help can really become independent taxpayers. When we know that giving somebody a home, makes all the difference in terms of whether they will get better and whether they will become independent, and living a life on the street is so costly to all of us. But again, it's a lot about messaging. I think there are also very specific changes in policies around benefits, around how people can qualify for benefits, loss of benefits to people around food programs, etc., that are out there. So the advocacy piece that I think we see going forward is also really critical. But I see those as very related. If you feel like people getting food stamps are just ripping off the public rather than meeting unmet food needs and really struggling to get by almost entirely, then of course you don't care if we start cutting people off who can't find jobs.
So I'm going to make a statement now that might get me in a lot of trouble, but it's just an educated guess based on a lot of my experiences, that the problem with the messaging, or the problem with getting the message out, is that there's probably a large group of people who are afraid of hearing the message because it might be them someday.
Sure. I mean, we know that, as I said, when you look at who's homeless, whether it's, and we work with homeless veterans, we know that, these are folks that have done a lot, that have had a positive life experience. It's not that far from anybody if you lose your job, if you have a family conflict of some kind, if you're somebody who has a child, say, with major disabilities and you don't have coverage, if you're hit with a major illness, no one is that far from homelessness, or certainly from losing most everything. And I think it's very difficult for people to really to look at that and not be afraid of talking about it. I think we often find that some of the people who are most judgmental or most angry about these things are people who don't realize how much they depend on all the same public resources. I mean, I always say, we used to, when this country began, we had private fire departments, we had private police departments, everything was private. We had private education. I don't think we want to go back to all that being private. Things became public because we needed them, and we need this as well.
So Governor LePage is advocating to put property taxes on nonprofits. How will that affect Preble Street if that happens?
Certainly, it would affect us in the sense that we would have a tax bill that we don't have now. We think we're good neighbors. We have a lot of jobs that we create all the time, every time we add a new program. It's more jobs, it's more taxes. Nonprofits are a big source of jobs in this state.
Right.
So, cutting into our ability to do that by putting us into a position of paying taxes I think for a lot of organizations will either have them laying off staff or doing other cuts. For us, we always find a way to manage, so I don't really know what it would look like. We have property, they're all things that are used to help people.
Right.
It doesn't feel like a great idea to us. And of course, we also think there's much more of an obligation on the state's part to take responsibility for a lot of the services and the funding, whether it's general assistance or meeting the needs of people with mental illness. So kind of putting more of that back on localities and the local communities, it doesn't seem like it saves anything. It just shifts the burden and puts a lot more burden on us.
All right, so we're running out of time, and I have a couple canned questions I have to go through on each show.
Sure.
What has been your biggest eye-opening experience working for Preble Street?
I think that's easy. We opened a Housing First program where we took, at Logan Place, where we took all the most challenged individuals who'd been homeless for years and said, just come and get housed. Don't worry about your substance abuse, your mental health, anything else. Everyone doubted it would work. It's been an amazing success, and in just the first year, it's probably the most inspiring thing I've ever done. And we've done a lot of programs,
Right.
But we've built on that to recognize that we can solve homelessness. We can house anybody if we do it right.
All right, I'm on a roll here. So, do you have an estimated cost of what it costs per person to house them in a shelter?
I don't. Oh, in a shelter or I don't. I know. I can tell you. I could, if I was prepared, I'd give you our cost study and I'd read it right off. We did a very detailed cost study of the cost.
Ballpark. Quick.
Oh, it costs thousands for people to stay in the shelter. It also costs thousands because they tend to use lots of other services, inpatient, outpatient, emergency rooms. It's a lot cheaper to house them.
All right. So, if someone wanted to make a donation to help you with this, who would they contact?
They would contact Preble Street and ask for our development department.
And how would they contact Preble Street?
That would be at two ways. At preblestreet.org is our website, and you'd get all the information you need on how to make a donation there. Or you can call 775-0026, and if you mention you want to make a donation, I'm sure you'll get to the right place quickly.
All right. Usually I say, any questions for me? But I'm going to say, do you have a question for me?
Wow. Let's see.
Time's up.
Great.
All right. Well, I really want to thank you for joining us today. It was a great show. Next week, we have part 2 of Meeting the Consultants. The music appears courtesy of Mike Hubbard. You can find Mike's music on www.michaelhubbardmusic.com. Check out Mike's website